The winter wind howled through the stone corridors of Aldemir Castle like the wailing of forgotten ghosts, carrying with it the scent of pine and the bitter promise of snow. Prince Aldric stood at the narrow window of his chambers, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he gazed out at the kingdom that would one day be his. The land stretched endlessly before him, a tapestry of frost-covered fields and dark forests, villages clustered like scattered seeds beneath the iron sky. He had been born to rule these lands, raised from infancy to understand that every decision, every word, every heartbeat belonged not to him, but to the crown that would rest upon his head. Yet as he stood there in the gathering dusk, his thoughts were not of kingdoms or crowns, but of a pair of gentle eyes, the color of summer earth, and a smile that made his carefully constructed world tremble at its foundations. Her name was Ilara, and she was nothing. That was what the world would say, what his father King Hrothgar had declared with such finality when the whispers first reached the throne room. She was a servant, a girl who scrubbed floors and carried water, whose hands were rough from labor, and whose birth was marked by no title, no land, no lineage worth recording in the great books of noble families. She had come to the castle 3 years ago, arriving with a merchant's caravan that had sought shelter during a particularly vicious storm. The merchant had offered her as payment for the king's hospitality, a transaction as common and unremarkable as trading a horse or a bolt of cloth. Aldric had barely noticed her that first day, just another face among the dozens of servants who moved through the castle like shadows, their existence defined entirely by their usefulness to those who mattered. But fate, as Aldric would come to understand, cared nothing for the careful hierarchies of men. It had been a spring morning when everything changed, when he had descended to the castle gardens, seeking solitude from the endless lessons in statecraft and military strategy that filled his days. He had found her there among the roses, singing softly to herself as she tended the flower beds. Her voice had been like water over stones, clear and pure and utterly unself-conscious, and he had stopped on the pathway, frozen by something he could not name. She had not noticed him at first, lost in her work and her song, and he had watched her with a strange tightness in his chest as the morning sunlight caught in her dark hair and painted golden shadows across her face. When she finally turned and saw him standing there, she had gasped and immediately dropped into a deep curtsy, her face flushing with embarrassment at being caught singing in the presence of royalty. He had told her to rise, had assured her that her voice was beautiful and that she should not be ashamed, and when she had looked up at him with those earth-brown eyes full of surprise and gratitude, something inside him had shifted irrevocably. From that day forward, Aldric found excuses to walk in the gardens, to pass through the corridors where she worked, to catch glimpses of her as she went about her duties. He told himself it was mere curiosity, a passing fancy that would fade like morning mist under the sun's warm gaze. But the feeling only grew stronger, fed by stolen glances and brief exchanges of words, by the way his heart would race when he heard her laughter echoing from some distant room. He began to learn the rhythms of her days, the places she would be at certain hours, and he shaped his own movements to intersect with hers, as if by accident. She was always respectful, always proper in his presence, but gradually he detected something else in her manner, a softness in her expression when she looked at him, a lingering quality to her smiles that spoke of feelings that mirrored his own. It was madness, of course. He knew this even as he fell deeper into his obsession with her. He was the crown prince of Aldemir, first son of King Hrothgar the Stern, heir to a throne that had stood for 300 years. His marriage had been a topic of discussion since his birth, with various noble families positioning their daughters like chess pieces on a board, each hoping to secure the ultimate prize of a royal union. His father had already begun negotiations with the Kingdom of Westmarch, where Princess Isadora waited with her political connections and her suitable bloodline, a young woman Aldric had met exactly twice and found to be perfectly pleasant and perfectly uninteresting. The marriage was expected, inevitable, a duty he had always understood he would fulfill without question or complaint. Love, as his tutors had often reminded him, was a luxury reserved for common folk, while royalty dealt in alliances and the cold calculus of power. But the heart, Aldrich discovered, was a rebellious thing that refused to bow to logic or duty. As the months passed and spring gave way to summer and then autumn, his feelings for Ilara transformed from a fascination into something deeper and more consuming than anything he had ever known. He began to seek her out deliberately, no longer content with chance encounters and distant observations. Late at night, when the castle slept and the guards grew drowsy at their posts, he would slip through the servants' passages to the small room she shared with 3 other maids. They would sit together in the dim candlelight, speaking in hushed voices about everything and nothing, and he learned that beneath her humble circumstances lived a mind as sharp as any scholar's and a spirit as brave as any knight's. She told him stories of her childhood in a village so small it had no name, of a mother who had died bringing her into the world, and a father who had worked himself into an early grave trying to feed his children. She spoke of dreams she had never dared voice to anyone else, of longing to read and write, to see the great cities beyond Aldermere's borders, to be more than the circumstances of her birth allowed. Aldrich found himself sharing things with her that he had never told another soul, fears and doubts that a prince was never supposed to acknowledge. He confessed his terror at the thought of ruling, at the weight of responsibility that would one day crush down upon his shoulders, at the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who saw him not as a person, but as a symbol, a vessel for their hopes and ambitions. With Ilara, he was simply Aldrich. Not prince or future king, but just a man who laughed at her clever observations and felt his soul lift when she smiled at him. She listened without judgment, offered comfort without flattery, and saw him with a clarity that was both frightening and exhilarating. In her presence, the carefully constructed armor he wore every day dissolved, leaving him vulnerable and oddly free. As winter approached and the first snows began to fall, Aldrich came to a realization that both terrified and liberated him. He loved her, not with the tepid affection that was expected between royal spouses, not with the strategic appreciation of a beneficial alliance, but with a passion that burned in his chest and kept him awake through the long, dark hours of night. He loved her laugh and her kindness, her strength and her vulnerability, the way she moved through the world with quiet dignity, despite the way it sought to diminish her. He loved her not despite who she was, but because of it, because she had carved out a space of humanity and warmth in a place that so often felt cold and inhuman. And as he lay in his grand canopied bed, staring at the ceiling while the wind rattled the shutters, he began to understand that this love would force him to make a choice that would alter the course of his life and the future of the kingdom itself. The confrontation came on a bitter January night when King Hrothgar summoned him to the throne room. Aldrich had known this moment was approaching, had felt its inevitability in the worried glances of servants and the whispered conversations that ceased when he entered a room. Despite his caution, despite his attempts at discretion, word of his attachment to Ilara had reached his father's ears, carried by those who made it their business to collect and trade in secrets. The king sat upon his throne of carved oak and iron, his face as hard as the stone walls surrounding them, and beside him stood Lord Maeric, the king's chief counsellor, a man whose thin smile and cold eyes had always made Aldrich's skin crawl. His father's voice when he spoke was like the crack of ice breaking on a frozen lake, sharp and final. He demanded to know if the rumours were true, if his son and heir had indeed been consorting with a servant girl, debasing himself and bringing shame upon the royal house. Aldrich stood straight and met his father's gaze without flinching, and in that moment he made a decision that would echo through the ages. He told the truth. He confirmed that he had spent time with Elara, that he cared for her deeply, and then, with his heart hammering in his chest and his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands, he told his father that he loved her and intended to make her his wife. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of logs in the great fireplace. King Hrothgar's face went through a remarkable transformation, from shock to disbelief, to a rage so profound that Aldrich half expected flames to burst from his father's mouth. The king rose from his throne, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire room, and when he spoke, his voice was a thunderclap that made the very walls seem to shake. He called Aldrich a fool, a disgrace, a betrayal of everything their family had built across generations. He reminded his son that kings do not marry for love, that the crown required sacrifice and duty above all else, that the marriage to Princess Isadora had already been promised and could not be broken without insulting Westmarch and potentially triggering war. He spoke of responsibility and legacy, of the thousands of people who depended on the stability of the throne, of the chaos that would result from such an unprecedented breach of tradition and protocol. Aldrich listened to his father's fury and felt something break inside him, not his resolve, but rather the chains of expectation that had bound him since birth. He understood everything his father said, recognized the truth in his warnings about political consequences and social upheaval, but he also understood, with a clarity that seemed to burn away all doubt, that a life without Elara was not a life at all, that being king without being able to choose his own heart was a prison more complete than any dungeon cell. He spoke calmly, respectfully, but firmly. He told his father that he understood the cost of his choice, that he recognized he was asking for something unprecedented, but that he would not and could not marry anyone but Elara. He offered to give up the throne, to abdicate his position as heir, to walk away from the crown if that was what his love required. The king's response was immediate and devastating. He banished Elara from the castle that very night, ordering guards to seize her from her quarters and escort her beyond the kingdom's borders before dawn broke. He told Aldrich that he would marry Princess Isadora as planned, that this madness would be forgotten, and that if he ever attempted to contact the servant girl again, he would declare his son a traitor to the crown and hunt him down like a common criminal. Aldrich begged and pleaded, and finally raged against his father's decree, but the king was immovable as mountain stone, convinced that this was the only way to save his foolish son from destroying himself and the kingdom. Lord Merrick stood silent throughout the exchange, his thin smile suggesting he took a certain pleasure in watching the prince's world crumble around him. That night, Aldrich made his choice. As the castle bells tolled midnight, he gathered what supplies he could carry, took a small bag of coins from his personal treasury, and made his way through the servants' passages one last time. He intercepted Elara and her guards at the southern gate, arriving just as they were preparing to thrust her out into the winter darkness. The guards were shocked to see the prince appear from the shadows, more shocked still when he commanded them to release her, and absolutely stunned when he removed the silver circlet from his head, the symbol of his royal status, and placed it on the ground at their feet. In a voice that carried the weight of absolute finality, he renounced his claim to the throne, declared himself no longer Prince of Aldemir, and took Elara's hand in his own. The guards did not know what to do, caught between loyalty to the prince they had served and orders from their king. In their moment of hesitation, Aldrich and Elara slipped through the gate and into the night, leaving behind the castle, the crown, and the only life Aldrich had ever known. They walked through snow and darkness, driven by fear and hope in equal measure, until the walls of Aldemir Castle were lost behind them in the swirling white storm. Behind them, they left chaos. When King Hrothgar learned what his son had done, his rage was terrible to behold. He declared Aldrich dead to the kingdom, struck his name from the royal records, and named his younger son Edmund as heir to the throne. He sent riders throughout the land with proclamations declaring that the former prince was now a traitor and that any who aided him would face execution. He married Edmund to Princess Isadora in a hasty ceremony designed to repair the political damage and reassure Westmarch that Aldemir remained a reliable ally. But the king could not control the stories that began to spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The tale of the prince who gave up everything for love captured the imagination of commoners and nobles alike, and songs were written and ballads composed telling of Aldric's sacrifice. Some called him a romantic hero, others a selfish fool, but everyone had an opinion about what had transpired. The kingdom was divided, with passionate arguments erupting in taverns and marketplaces, in castle halls and peasant hovels. Some admired Aldric's courage and saw in his choice a nobility greater than any crown could bestow, while others viewed his actions as the ultimate betrayal, a dereliction of duty that prioritized personal happiness over the welfare of thousands. The controversy deepened the rift between different factions of nobility, with some using Aldric's example to question the absolute authority of the crown, while others demanded even stricter adherence to tradition and hierarchy. Aldric and Ilara, meanwhile, began a new life far from the intrigues of court and the judgments of society. They travelled east, through villages and towns where Aldric's face was not yet known, working odd jobs and sleeping in barns and cheap inns. The journey was hard in ways Aldric had never experienced, his body unaccustomed to physical labour, and his pride struggling with the drastic change in his circumstances. There were nights when he lay awake wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, if love was truly worth the loss of everything he had been raised to value. But then Ilara would turn to him in the darkness, and he would feel the warmth of her presence. And in those moments all doubt would fall away. They were together, they were free, and somehow that was enough. They eventually settled in a small coastal town called Seabrook, far beyond the borders of Aldemir, where Aldric's past was unknown and unimportant. He found work as a scribe, his education finally proving useful in an unexpected way, while Ilara took in mending and helped the local midwife. They rented a small cottage at the edge of town, a humble dwelling with a leaking roof and a temperamental fireplace that bore no resemblance to the grand chambers Aldric had occupied as a prince. Yet he found himself happier in that cottage than he had ever been in the castle, discovering joy in simple things like cooking meals together, repairing the roof side by side, falling asleep to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Ilara bloomed in their new life, no longer constrained by the rigid hierarchies of the castle, her natural intelligence and kindness making her beloved among their neighbours. She learned to read and write with Aldric as her teacher, devouring every book they could afford or borrow, and he watched with pride as she transformed from a servant who had been taught to make herself invisible into a woman who stood tall and spoke her mind. They married in a simple ceremony conducted by the local priest, with fishermen and shopkeepers as their witnesses instead of nobles and dignitaries. Aldric had never felt more like himself than he did standing before that altar, making vows not because duty demanded it, but because his heart insisted on it. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Ilara's smile was more precious to him than any crown jewel, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. They built a life together, modest but rich in the things that mattered. Aldric discovered talents he had never known he possessed, a gift for teaching that led to children from the town coming to him for lessons, a skill with carpentry that allowed him to supplement their income by building furniture. Ilara became indispensable to the community, her gentle wisdom sought out by neighbours facing difficult decisions, her healing knowledge passed down from the midwife saving lives during difficult births. Time passed, measured not in royal ceremonies and state functions, but in seasons and simple milestones. They weathered storms and celebrated harvests, mourned neighbours who passed and rejoiced at the births of new children in the community. Aldric's hands grew calloused and his face weathered by sun and salt air, all traces of princehood worn away by honest labor. Elara's hair began to show threads of silver, her face marked by lines that spoke of laughter and love rather than servitude and fear. They had 2 children, a boy they named Thomas and a girl called Meredith, and Aldric found that fatherhood brought a fulfillment he had never imagined possible. He taught his children to read and think and question, to value kindness over status and integrity over advantage, to understand that true nobility came from character rather than birth. They grew up knowing nothing of castles or crowns, unaware that their father had once been royalty, and Aldric was content to keep it that way. But the past, as Aldric would eventually learn, is never truly escaped. News from Aldemir filtered to them occasionally, through travelling merchants and wandering bards, tales of King Hrothgar's declining health and the struggles of Prince Edmund to establish his authority as heir. The old king, it was said, had never recovered from his eldest son's betrayal, the wound to his pride festering like an infected cut. He had become more tyrannical in his final years, more suspicious of everyone around him, seeing traitors and schemers in every shadow. When he finally died in the 7th year of Aldric's exile, some said his last words were a curse upon his firstborn son, while others claimed he had wept and called out for Aldric in his final moments. Edmund took the throne with none of his older brother's natural charisma or leadership ability, and the kingdom suffered for it. He was a weak king, easily manipulated by advisors like Lord Myrick, making decisions that favored the wealthy and noble while ignoring the needs of common people. Aldric heard these stories with a complicated mixture of sadness and relief. Part of him mourned for his father, despite everything that had passed between them, and worried for the kingdom he had once been destined to rule. But another part, the part that had grown strong in his years away, recognized that he had never been suited for kingship, that the man he had become in Seabrook was more authentic than the prince he had been raised to be. He discussed his feelings with Elara during long evening conversations, and she listened with the same patient wisdom that had first drawn him to her. She reminded him that he had saved far more than himself when he walked away from the crown, that he had saved her from a life of servitude, had saved their children from being pawns in political games, had even perhaps saved Aldemir from a king who would have been miserable and ineffective because his heart belonged elsewhere. The kingdom, however, did not forgive so easily. As the years passed and Edmund's rule proved increasingly disastrous, people began to look back on Aldric's departure not as romantic tragedy, but as a catastrophic abandonment. Stories changed, perspectives shifted, and the prince, who had once been celebrated in songs, became a villain in the public imagination. They blamed him for King Hrothgar's bitter final years, for Edmund's weakness, for every setback and difficulty the kingdom faced. The nobility, who had been divided over his choice, gradually united in condemnation, finding it useful to have a scapegoat for problems that predated his abdication. Even the common folk who had once admired his courage began to turn against him, their own hardships making them less sympathetic to a man who had chosen personal happiness over communal responsibility. Ballads that once praised him were rewritten with new verses that cast him as a selfish coward, and his name became synonymous with dereliction of duty. When Aldric was 40 years old, a messenger arrived in Seabrook, bearing a letter sealed with the royal crest of Aldemir. His heart clenched when he saw that seal, memories flooding back with painful clarity, but he opened the letter with steady hands as Elara stood beside him, her presence lending him strength. The letter was from Edmund, and its contents were shocking. The king was dying, succumbing to the same wasting sickness that had claimed their grandfather, and he had no heir. Princess Isadora had proven unable to bear children, and Edmund's desperate attempts to father a child by other means had failed. The royal line of Aldemir was ending, and in his desperation Edmund was reaching out to the brother he had not spoken to in 20 years. He begged Aldrich to return, to reclaim his birthright and secure the succession, to save the kingdom from the civil war that would surely erupt if no clear heir could be established. He promised forgiveness, restoration of titles and lands, anything Aldrich might desire, if only he would come home and accept the crown. Aldrich read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing new layers of complexity to his emotions. Here was everything he had walked away from, being offered back to him on a silver platter: the crown, the power, the chance to shape the future of Aldemir according to his own vision. He could return in triumph, the prodigal prince reclaiming his destiny, his children elevated to royalty, and his wife installed as queen. All he had to do was leave behind the life he had built, the peace he had found, the authenticity that had come from living without pretense or expectation. He looked at Ilara, seeking in her face some guidance, some indication of what she thought he should do. But she said only that the choice was his to make, that she would support whatever decision he reached, though her eyes held a shadow of fear that she could not quite disguise. For days, Aldrich wrestled with the question, his mind churning through arguments and counter-arguments, possibilities and consequences. He walked the beaches of Seabrook alone, watching the waves crash and retreat in their eternal rhythm, seeking in nature's patterns some answer to his dilemma. He spoke with Thomas and Meredith, now young adults themselves, explaining to them for the first time the full story of who their father had been and what he had given up. They listened in stunned silence as he told them of castles and crowns, of the life they could have if he accepted Edmund's offer. Thomas was intrigued by the possibility, his young man's ambition sparked by visions of power and importance. But Meredith was more skeptical, asking her father if he truly believed he could return to a world he had rejected so completely. In the end, it was not logic or duty that guided Aldrich's decision, but rather the simple truth of who he had become. He sat down at his desk and composed a reply to Edmund, his hand steady as he wrote words that sealed his fate one final time. He expressed sorrow for his brother's illness and sympathy for the kingdom's difficulties, but he declined the offer to return. He explained that he was no longer the man who had worn the crown prince's circlet, that he had found a different kind of nobility in honest work and genuine relationships, that the kingdom deserved a ruler whose heart was fully committed to the responsibility, rather than someone who had already demonstrated that he would choose love over duty. He suggested that Edmund look to the children of their father's cousins for an heir, that there were others with royal blood who might serve Aldemir well, and he wished his brother peace in his final days, forgiveness for any pain his long-ago choice had caused, and hoped that they might meet again in whatever lay beyond this life. He sent the letter with the messenger and prepared himself for the consequences of his refusal. They came more swiftly than he anticipated. Within weeks, new proclamations arrived in Seabrook, carried by royal heralds who posted them in the town square for all to read. King Edmund, in his anger and disappointment, had declared Aldrich a permanent exile, forbidden from ever setting foot in Aldemir on pain of death. He declared that Aldrich's children were not legitimate heirs and could make no claim on the throne or any royal property. He denounced his older brother as a traitor who had twice abandoned the kingdom in its hour of need, and he commanded that all citizens of Aldemir were to consider Aldrich as dead and his name never to be spoken with anything but contempt. The proclamations changed things for Aldrich and his family. Some of their neighbors in Seabrook, learning of their royal connection and the controversy surrounding it, began to treat them differently. Some were awed and overly deferential, while others became cold and suspicious, wondering what other secrets they might be hiding. The easy anonymity they had enjoyed for so many years was shattered, replaced by constant awareness of being watched and judged. Travelers began arriving in Seabrook specifically to catch a glimpse of the infamous prince who had thrown away a crown, and their little cottage became the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations. Thomas struggled with anger at his father for denying them a life of privilege and power, while Meredith worried about how the attention would affect her own prospects for marriage and happiness. Aldrich felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him as never before, the accumulated cost of following his heart made manifest in the changed expressions of his children and the transformed dynamics of his community. There were nights when doubt gnawed at him, when he wondered if he had been selfish not once but twice, first in leaving the kingdom and now in refusing to return to save it. Ilara sensed his turmoil and reminded him gently that no choice was without consequence, that every path involved sacrifice, but that the life they had built together had been real and meaningful in ways that the hollow ceremony of court could never be. She told him that she would not trade a single day of their life together for all the crowns in the world, and hearing her say this with absolute conviction helped ease the ache in his chest. King Edmund died 6 months after sending his desperate letter, and Aldemir descended into the political chaos he had predicted. Various factions of nobility put forward competing claims to the throne, distant cousins and ambitious lords who saw opportunity in the crisis. A brief but brutal civil war erupted, tearing the kingdom apart as different armies fought for control of the crown. Trade collapsed, villages were burned, and innocent people suffered and died while nobles played their games of power. The kingdom that Aldrich had once been destined to rule was torn apart by the very instability his abdication had been meant to prevent, and he could not escape the irony that his choice had ultimately led to the disaster his father had feared. Word of the suffering reached Seabrook through refugees who fled the violence, and Aldrich felt each report like a knife to the heart. He tried to help where he could, using his meager savings to aid refugees in finding shelter and work, teaching them skills that would help them rebuild their lives. But it felt like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon, hopelessly inadequate in the face of the massive devastation. Thomas confronted him angrily one night, demanding to know how he could live with himself, knowing that his selfishness had contributed to so much misery. Aldrich had no good answer, could only say that he had made the best choices he knew how to make with the understanding he had at the time, that he had tried to find a middle path between duty and love, and had perhaps satisfied neither. The civil war eventually ended when a coalition of moderate nobles agreed to support Lady Katrina, a daughter of King Hrothgar's cousin, who had proven herself a capable administrator and mediator during the conflict. She took the throne not as an absolute monarch, but as a constitutional ruler, agreeing to share power with a newly formed council of nobles and common representatives. It was a radical transformation of Aldemir's government, one that likely would never have happened if the traditional succession had proceeded smoothly. Some historians would later argue that Aldrich's abdication, for all its painful consequences, had inadvertently paved the way for a more just and equitable system of governance. Others maintained that the same outcome could have been achieved without the years of bloodshed and suffering that preceded it. Aldrich lived to see his 60th year, his hair white and his body worn by decades of hard labor. He never returned to Aldemir, keeping his exile even after Lady Katrina sent word that she would welcome him if he wished to visit. He remained in Seabrook, in the cottage he had shared with Ilara for so many years, surrounded by the community they had become part of. Thomas eventually forgave him, coming to understand as he grew older and had children of his own that the choices parents make are never as simple as they appear to their children. Meredith married a local ship captain and gave Aldrich grandchildren who climbed on his lap and begged for stories, though he carefully edited out the parts about crowns and castles, preferring to tell them tales of adventure and true love instead. Ilara remained at his side through all of it, her presence the one constant in a life defined by dramatic change. They grew old together in the way Aldrich had once thought impossible, their love deepening with time rather than fading. She was his companion, his conscience, his comfort, and when she died in her sleep at the age of 62, Aldrich felt as though half of his soul had been torn away. He mourned her with a grief that was both profound and strangely peaceful, because he knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment, every sacrifice, every condemnation had been worth it for the years he had spent as her husband. He had no regrets, or at least none that mattered in the face of what they had shared. Aldrich followed Ilara into death 3 years later, passing quietly in his sleep, with his children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. His last words, spoken so softly that only Thomas leaning close could hear them, were a repetition of something he had said many times over the years. He said that he had been offered a choice between a crown and a heart, and he had chosen the heart, and though the world would never forgive him for it, he had never for a moment wished he had chosen differently. Thomas held his father's hand as the old man's breathing slowed and finally stopped, and he wept for the complicated, courageous, flawed man who had given up everything for love. The kingdom of Aldemir never did forgive Aldrich, not truly. His name remained controversial, a subject of debate among scholars and philosophers who argued about duty versus personal freedom, responsibility versus individual happiness. Some saw him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of putting personal desires above communal needs, while others viewed him as a hero who had the courage to reject an unjust system that treated people as pawns rather than individuals. Songs were still sung about him, though their tone varied wildly depending on who was singing. In Seabrook, he was remembered fondly as a good neighbor and devoted husband, a man who had lived with integrity even when it cost him dearly. In the halls of Aldemir Castle, his portrait hung in a darkened corridor, his face forever frozen in youth, a reminder of the price of choosing love over duty. The truth, as Aldrich himself had come to understand, was more complex than either condemnation or celebration could capture. He had made a choice that was simultaneously selfish and selfless, that prioritized his own happiness while also honoring the deepest truth of his existence. He had hurt people through his decision, had failed to prevent suffering that his presence might have mitigated, but he had also lived authentically in a way few people ever managed. He had proven that it was possible to walk away from power, to choose love over legacy, to define nobility on one's own terms rather than accepting the definitions imposed by history and tradition. Whether that made him a hero or a villain depended entirely on what one believed about the nature of duty, the value of love, and the right of individuals to shape their own destinies. In the end, Aldrich's story became what all great stories become, a mirror in which people saw reflections of their own struggles and choices. Those who had sacrificed personal happiness for responsibility found in him either validation or cautionary warning, while those who had chosen love over duty saw either inspiration or justification. The kingdom never forgave him because kingdoms, being collective entities built on shared sacrifice and common purpose, cannot easily forgive those who place individual desire above communal need. But individuals, particularly those who had loved deeply and sacrificed greatly, understood in their hearts what Aldrich had known from the moment he took Ilara's hand and walked away from his birthright. Some things are worth more than crowns. Some loves are worth any price, and the only life worth living is the one that honors the deepest truths of the heart, regardless of what the world might say. The prince who became a carpenter, the heir who chose exile, the man who renounced a throne for love of a servant, these were all the same person, and the kingdom could neither fully condemn nor completely forgive him because his choice called into question the very foundations upon which power and privilege were built. If a prince could walk away from his destiny and find happiness in obscurity, what did that say about the value of the destiny itself? If love between a royal and a servant could be more meaningful than a strategic marriage between kingdoms, what did that reveal about the arbitrary nature of social hierarchy? These were dangerous questions, the kind that made the powerful uncomfortable and gave hope to those without power. And so Aldrich's memory remained forever controversial, forever debated, forever unforgiven, but also forever admired by those brave enough to ask themselves what they would do if faced with the same impossible choice. And perhaps that was the most fitting legacy for a man who had lived his life at the intersection of duty and desire, who had proven that the human heart was stronger than any crown, and that true nobility came not from birth or title, but from the courage to be authentic, to love fully, and to accept the consequences of living according to one's deepest convictions. The kingdom never forgave him, but in not forgiving him, it ensured that his story would never be forgotten, that future generations would continue to wrestle with the questions his life raised about power and love, duty and freedom, the obligations we owe to society, and the obligations we owe to ourselves. Aldrich had renounced a throne for love of a servant, and though the kingdom never forgave him, he had found something infinitely more valuable than forgiveness or approval. He had found truth, he had found love, and he had found himself, and in the final accounting, that made him richer than any king who ever wore a crown. If you enjoyed this story of love, sacrifice, and the courage to follow one's heart against impossible odds, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more medieval tales that explore the timeless struggles of the human spirit. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you were in Prince Aldrich's position, would you have chosen the throne or true love? What do you think matters more, duty to the kingdom or loyalty to your heart? Share your perspective and let's discuss this fascinating dilemma together.